that there's the Riverside Expressway. It opened on the 22nd of July 1976. By 2016, the Riverside Expressway was listed as Queensland's most congested roadway. In this walk, I'm going to take a journey right along underneath the Riverside Expressway and find the remnants of the history of this, probably one of the most important parts of Brisbane's early history. And actually, right here at QUT Gardens Point there, this area here became a naval parade ground. After the 1974 floods, it was clear that some sort of flood mitigation had to happen here. The results of the construction of Wivenhoe Dam essentially changed the Brisbane River from being a freshwater river to a marine environment. That meant that where there was once fresh water, this became salt water, and today the salt water extends pretty much all the way up to the Bremer River. So these mangroves that you see here now only date really from the mid-1970s. There's a little beach down there. There were little sandy beaches along the Brisbane River, especially around at West End. And along the river where I am now, and on the other side of the river at South Bank, you used to get rainforest type conditions. It would have been beautiful down here. The clear fresh water, the rainforest, little sandy beaches. Where I'm standing right now, this used to be the end of Alice Street. Alice Street came right down here, and in the early 1860s there was a public swimming bath right here. The thing is, this was a council-run bath. There had been earlier ones further up the river that way, but they often sank. But baths were proving very, very popular, and so the council wanted to get in on the act. So because it was a council one and not a privately owned one, the fares for using it were quite cheap. So the baths here were known as the cheap baths. And it was just down here at the end of Alice Street on that side of the road. This was once the site of the City Morgue. Now the City Morgue has jumped around a few times over the years, so I'll explain it now.
Built in 1879, the City Morgue replaced an earlier one. It was destroyed in the 1893 flood. A new one was built higher up in 1910. In 1927, the whole thing was moved to below Alice Street when it again flooded. It was moved in 1962 and named the Institute of Forensic Pathology, where it remained until 1992. It was then moved to Kessels Road.
Now they've got a marker here. This is the Waterline Park, and it shows here the levels of flooding over the many, many years. There's the 2011 flood mark. 1974 is way up there, and then 1893 further up, and then right at the top is 1841. And in amongst this gym equipment at the end of Alice Street, this used to be the site of a very old and very busy wharf. Big cargo sailing ships would dock right here. The wharfs changed hands and changed names over many, many years, but they were also known as the Short Street wharves. And Short Street used to exist right behind me. Short Street is the only street in the old Brisbane city area that no longer exists. See if I can find where it was. So this is it, round about here. This is where Short Street used to be. The wharves were certainly torn out when the Riverside Expressway was put through, and I guess the street was just too close to where the new roadways were going to be, so the street was obliterated. And I believe the reason it was called Short Street was literally because it was a very short street. It linked Alice Street with Margaret Street. Anyway, back down to under the expressway. Just to my right over there, where they're doing some more works, that was the site of the Neville Bonner building, commemorating an Indigenous politician. The building, despite being quite a beautiful building and rather advanced for its time and winning architectural awards, was only in existence from 1998 to 2017. A lot of work's going on here, so it's a bit noisy. I apologise for that. This place here, where I am now, used to be the jetty for the yacht Lucinda, a very important part of Queensland's history. The vessel was built in Scotland in 1884. Later on, the ship had a rather ignoble existence before being wrecked on the artificial Bishop Island out in Moreton Bay. Bishop Island is now subsumed under Fisherman Islands. I'm approaching the old commissariat store, and in this area I can smell wood chip, smell of the lumber over there, the treated wood, which is very appropriate because this part of the river here was historically the site of sawmills. There was Pettigrew's sawmill, and there was also Binstead's sawmill. We'll get to Binstead later in the Coomera video. There was a bit of rivalry, I think, between the two families, and then one day, under suspicious circumstances, Pettigrew's sawmill burnt down, and I think he was pointing the finger of blame at Binstead. There's the commissariat store just over there. Difficult place to stop here. I've got to keep walking because the cyclists really come through here at like 50 k's an hour. Now, because of the works down here, I've overshot where I need to be, so I'm going to cross over. And now passing the commissariat store. This was completed in 1829, and it was essentially a warehouse, a place where goods and food and grains and clothing and farm equipment could be safely stored. Very, very strong building, and then distributed to the workforce, convict gangs, and then the early settlers as well. The top floor was added in 1913, but out the front of the building, in that area there, was where Queen's Wharf was. Ships would dock out there at Queen's Wharf, unload their goods, and convicts, and settlers, free settlers as well. Later on, in fact, the building is just over there. That's a later immigration depot where people arriving from the ships could go and stay before they got accommodation and got land further out in the colony. And it was later on that vessels sailing between Brisbane and Ipswich used the Queen's Wharf as their main wharf. That building there is the old State Library. It used to be known as the William Street Library. It was built between 1876 and 1879. It started life as a museum. However, it was kind of hopeless as a museum. It was a bit cramped and really just not enough floor space for all the exhibits. So it was in, when was it? 1899. That's when the museum moved from here over to Gregory Terrace in the old museum, that red brick building over there. And it's a beautiful building. And then in 1959, this annex was added to the side of the old library. I've got to say, in all honesty, I can't stand 1950s architecture. I mean, look at it. Look at its ungodliness. I know at the time it was considered to be very progressive and modern, but I think it's modern, postmodern, and now kitsch all at the same time. There's the old library up there, and just beneath it, down on the river there was another floating public baths. I'm standing underneath the Victoria Bridge. This is actually the fourth bridge on this site. The first one was built in 1865 and was simply known as the Brisbane Bridge. At the time, council couldn't afford or wouldn't fork out the money for a steel bridge, so they settled on a wooden one. It didn't last too long. It collapsed 3 years later, much to the pleasure of the local ferry boat operators, who are now back in business. The first Victoria Bridge was built in 1874. Half of it was then washed away in the floods of 1893. It was in 1897 that the second Victoria Bridge was built, and that was the one that lasted until 1969. You can see in this photo the old bridge coming down and the new one being built. So that brings us to the third Victoria Bridge, built in 1969, and it was the fourth bridge on this site. That's it over there. I tell you what, it's so noisy down here. The entire Riverside Expressway right above me. Non-stop noise, as you would expect. But we're so close to it that it echoes. So I don't know how good the sound's going to be down here. Just moving on a little bit further from the Victoria Bridge. And just up this way here, not too far ahead of me, there was another jetty here. And this was for the boat to Bishop Island. A lot of old ships, the hulls of ships we used, sand was piled up. And over time, vegetation grew on it. And people would go out there for a day trip from Brisbane, leaving from here. You can see there on the right how the land slopes straight down. This was the geography of this part of the river here. Most of your development, the commissariat store and the wharves, Short Street, that's all that way. Further to the south, what would that be? The southeast. Today, of course, you've got this bike path and walkway along here, so people can access it. The 2011 flood marker. That's about, well, I'm 6 feet tall, so that's about 9 feet underwater here. So here's the John Oxley Memorial. I covered this in a previous video about whether the founder of Brisbane was insane, so I'm not going to dwell on that one. A couple of memorials here. That's the first one. In the wrong spot, I might add. Now I'm coming to another memorial to the unknown pioneers. There we go. Unknown pioneers. And this is it. This is the one I was looking for. This is the plaque from the opening of the Riverside Expressway, 1976, by His Excellency Air Marshal Sir Colin Hanna. That has definitely got to be the most well-hidden plaque in Queensland. So here's some information about the opening of the expressway.
The expressway was proposed by American consulting engineering firm Wilbur Smith and Associates in 1965 as part of a Brisbane transportation study. Apart from the construction of highways, the plan also recommended the removal of Brisbane's trams. Construction of the Riverside Expressway began in 1968, and on the 22nd of July 1976, it was officially opened by the Governor of Queensland in front of approximately 300 invited guests. The Australian newspaper on the 23rd of July 1976 reported that a main roads truck was brought to an adjacent lane to block out signs of protest held by a handful of conservationists. When the truck moved in front of the placards, the demonstrators carried them to a new position. The truck followed and the demonstrators returned to their original positions. The game went on throughout the ceremony, much to the delight of those in attendance.
Along here, back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, there were a number of boat sheds for rowing clubs. I think Brisbane Boys Grammar School had one, and there was a Toowong rowing club. Otherwise, the land was just way too steep to build anything along this stretch here. Now, I've just stopped and backed up a little bit because there is a source of water coming out from under North Quay. I always knew there was something here where water would always be pouring out. I don't know if it's an actual natural watercourse or if it's just a result of drains and modern plumbing, but it's right there. In fact, it looks like it's pretty much under the Silly Oxley Memorial. And that's really quite incredible. You can see the rock, the old rock face there. I wonder if that was visible before European settlement, if those rocks were exposed, or they've just, maybe there was soil over them, they got washed away, I don't know, but that's terrific. And what do we got here? Wages of sin is death. Bummer. I'm now coming to the end of the Riverside Expressway and the beginning of Coronation Drive. But there's one more thing up here, which I think is fascinating and little known. And right about this spot here, just under Skew Street, which is over there, there used to be the North Quay ferry service operating, departing from here and going over that way to West End. Obviously later, when the William Jolly Bridge was put in, this ferry service was no longer needed. Well, run out of Riverside Expressway. It finished just back there. But this wall here, you can see topped by the little brick wall. This here is a retaining wall built in 1887. Earlier in 1887, there had been yet another flood, and part of Coronation Drive, North Quay, fell into the Brisbane River. So it was clear something pretty serious had to be done to protect this road. And this is what they came up with, this massively thick retaining wall. There's a photograph of them building it. This area along the river here under the Riverside Expressway is going to be opened up to the public, and it's going to be a place of parks and cafes and enjoying the views of the river. And what I found on this walk is that when the Riverside Expressway went through in 1976, that essentially was the death knell of this entire area along the river. The past that existed under here, wharves and businesses, and even a street, Short Street, it's all gone. The only thing that I can find that's a remnant of the pre-expressway days is the commissariat stall. The Riverside Expressway was, of course, essential to help the growth of Brisbane, but it really did bring to an end a very early part of Brisbane and its history. It was covered over, blocked off, pulled down, and nobody noticed because everyone was too busy up there in their cars hurtling along to get to where they wanted to go to. But a fascinating walk nonetheless, and if you enjoyed it, please consider hitting that like and subscribe buttons. I'll see you again soon.